proponent of starting consumer first as a business, which is what you're doing right now. So how do you think about both understanding and serving the poor as a consumer, if I may use that phrase?
Yeah. So in my experience over the last sort of almost 12 years in this segment, what we found about sort of poor customers who are largely in the informal sector. So that's number one. Most of the poor work in the informal sector have no documented source of income, which automatically makes them, in today's world, data poor. But are they rational? Yes, they are perfectly rational. They are very smart. So let me give you an example. Why do poor customers pledge their gold and take expensive loans? And a lot of people say that, well, even with microfinance institutions, even with self-help groups, why are poor people still doing that? It's because essentially, if you think about a gold loan, it's available for a period of 2 days or 30 days. It's available for any amount. And if you think about, even though the interest rate might be higher, the absolute cost of credit, if you only needed money for 1 month for 4,000 rupees, is still lesser. So they're actually making a very rational choice when they're pledging their gold. So it's not, it is always a bit more nuanced. It's not interest rate versus interest rate. And the MFI is providing them a minimum 25,000 rupee loan, equal amortizing installments, and their life doesn't work in equal amortizing installments. So we need better product design. So what we've realized is that poor customers are indeed very rational when it comes to making choices. That's number one. They work in the informal sector. They're very credit worthy. I think because access to formal credit has been so hard to find, and when they actually get access to formal credit, they will, research even shows, quite heartbreakingly that they will even reduce food consumption in order to pay debt, which I'm sure India One customers will not do, likely, at least top part of India One customers will certainly not do, but extremely conscious of the fact that access to formal credit is not something they can take for granted, and that is also one of the big reasons moral hazard has traditionally been very low, because there are two ways in which you evaluate credit risk: moral hazard and capacity to pay. And on moral hazard, this customer actually scores very, very highly. And the third aspect is that in which poor customers are different is that they have very, very volatile lives. Again, primary research shows that the volatility of incomes is about 45%, 50%. Volatility of expenses is again about 45, 50%. So you can imagine your surpluses are volatile by 100%. That's a big number, and therefore we do need to revisit financial solutions design in light of this fact. This is a very big fact. It's challenging, but it's very solvable.
Great. So rational, volatile incomes, but most importantly, credit-worthy and reliable. I think that's a nice sort of takeaway. Dr. Joshi, let me bring you in, and you have spent a career working with on the problems of the small and marginal farmer in this country, and sort of perhaps take a producer lens. The farmer is essentially the poor as a producer. What are some of the sort of challenges you've seen for the small and marginal farmer when you think about markets? And market access is often talked about as one of those big, hard questions to solve in the agri space.
Thank you very much. I think that from majority of the poor are living in rural areas. So rural area is number one, and the small and marginal farmer, because of their tiny land holdings, majority of the farmers in India are small and marginal. Roughly 86% farmers are having land less than 2.5 hectares. And around 80% farmers have land less than 1 hectare. So this group of farmers, they have very low marketable surplus. When they have low marketable surplus, they do not have access to market. They do not have access to credit, as she was referring. The financial inclusion is not there. Lack of access to the extension services. So basic services which are necessary for small and marginal farmers are not available to them. This is number one. Second is the income level. Their income is so low that it affects their consumption basket. there is a low diet diversity of the small and marginal farmers as compared to the rich farmers or the urban population. So diet diversity is being considered, that if you have better diet diversity, then your nutrition level is much better. And these farmers who produce for us, they are facing the triple burden of malnutrition. You know, one is the food insecurity. They are food insecure. They are producing food, but they are food insecure. They do not have sufficient calories to eat from what they are producing. The second is undernourishment. Undernourishment is widespread in the families of the small and marginal farmer. And third is now the new issue is coming up is because of imbalance of dietary patterns, the obesity and the overweight is coming up. So these are the three problems which now marginal and small farmers are facing.
Yeah.
This is number one. Second is that they do not have access to the markets. Lots of reforms are taking place. I am very happy that the Jan Dhan Yojana have been initiated. The e-market, I will come to later on, the e-market has come up. So all these reforms are coming up. But what we are realizing that these reforms are not inclusive reforms. So we need to see that how institutional issues can be linked with these reforms so that they can participate in these reforms and the benefits goes to these farmer communities.
I want to probe you a little bit more on that. We'll come to that in terms of the reforms, and I think a lot of things which are considered to be helping small and marginal farmers may actually be challenging. But Birai, maybe I can move to you, and I think SEWA is an organization that is, I think, universally respected in this country. And one of the things that I personally greatly respect is your appetite for innovation and engaging with different kinds of players and not really having ideological sort of barriers to actually looking at these things. So I think when we're thinking about markets, and I know you've had a lot of experience working with the private sector, for example, and creating your own institutions, market institutions as well, what are some of the big learnings that you have taken away, both the good and the not so good?
Sure. So I think the first thing is that we were forced to innovate and be resourceful, because when we went to the mainstream banks, they told us, you're not bankable. When we went to the mainstream insurance companies, they said, you're bad risk. So willy-nilly, we had to innovate and be resourceful. And we know from the experience of many in this room that the poor women of this country are extremely resourceful. They know how to innovate, they know how to manage with less, they know how to run lean organizations better than most of us do. So that's the first point I wanted to make. If anyone would extend the hand and join, they're ready to join hands. And one of the experiences that we've had was with microinsurance. That's not much known. SEWA Bank's experience is known. But as I mentioned, when we banged on the doors of the nationalized insurance companies, they said, no, we can't insure poor women. You die too much, you get sick too much. It's not really a good proposition at all. But slowly we were able to show them that we are willing to contribute. We are not asking for a free ride here. But if we sit together at the table and develop products that we can afford, we are willing to pay for them. We want timely service, good claim servicing. So I think slowly we were able to sit with the insurance companies, and over the last 25 years, Vimo SEWA, which is SEWA Insurance, has now built up a very good partnership with both private insurance companies, which came in later, and the public sector. But it took a while. I remember one of the things that might seem surprising to this audience is that women's gynecological complaints were not covered by insurance companies, because they didn't think that was something that we should bother about. Right. Or when we spoke about occupational health of informal women workers and explained to them that when she's milking a buffalo, sometimes, she gets kicked and she may fracture her leg, and that is an occupational health condition that is worth covering, or snake bite when she goes into the field. These are things that were really way outside of the experience of the insurance companies. Sure. So we were able to bring this grassroots experience and reality, ground reality, if you will, and sit together and co-create. And I think that has been a really exciting journey.
Yeah. One sort of quick follow-up question to you, which is that you are a very unique organization, but you work with other organizations who are very different, right? One example is, I think, Sucharita's organization, Kaleidofin, which
Sure.
now you are collaborating with. How do you, how do you sort of work effectively with organizations that have a very different DNA, so to speak? What's the secret sauce of that?
So I think for starters, it's our values and our ideology. We are an organization that is influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's thinking, and we do believe in partnerships and in working shoulder to shoulder with people. So we're open to that, first and foremost. Secondly, we have no illusions that we have all the answers or solutions. We need the support of partners, experts, people from other countries who we've learned so much from, other organizations who are sitting in this room. I see my colleagues from Pradhan here. So that's the other thing. And the third thing is that we sit together all the time with our sisters. We work together with them shoulder to shoulder, day after day, year after year. And we listen, we try to bring our partners also into contact, and it's inspiring. Typically what we hear insurance companies or others from the mainstream say was that, these kind of insights we cannot imagine for people who hardly went to school. So I think it's a learning journey for everybody, and it's a rich journey.
Yeah.
And I think we humbly learn from each other.
Great. I think that open-mindedness is something which is pretty impressive. Param, I wanted to ask you actually a slightly provocative question, if you don't mind, which is moving to the tack of markets to public policy. And one of the, I know you've sort of based the Swachh Bharat on the pillar of Jan Andolan, but some would also argue that the subsidy or the incentive, I know as you call it, which is offered, is potentially a public policy intervention that is not that helpful, because purists would point to the case of a Bangladesh or a Vietnam perhaps, etc., which have achieved tremendous successes in open defecation without a government subsidy / incentive program. And some the extremists would say you need to do behavior change without the carrot of the incentive. What would you say to sort of those critics?
Sure. Now, both the countries you have mentioned, they took they took quite a long time to achieve what they achieved, and they had a fair amount of success. So as you mentioned, it's an incentive, and by the way, it's going to very poor people for the most part. So we're talking of poor people here, and incidentally, many communities have decided on their own what is that level of incentive which needs to be given. So the choice is with that rural community. So for example, in Bijnor in UP, I think in a village called Mubarakpur, the community decided that we don't need the incentive because we can afford it ourselves. So that flexibility is there, but for people who are really poor, they need that. So as far as we are concerned, our guidelines are very flexible. We think that it's important to invest in sanitation, and we think that this incentive, and people are spending their own money on top of that as well, if they can afford it. So it's important from a public policy point of view to give them that incentive. And of course, beyond that, once we become ODF, the behavior change kicks in and people sustain it themselves.
Sucharita, I know you probably need to leave shortly, so maybe I'll ask you one question before you step out. Just building on this thing of the role of public policy and the role of enablers and so on in making markets succeed. One of the things that we've seen in financial services is this whole digital infrastructure that Roger also talked about here, and India being almost like an example for the world with the Aadhaar and then building on it the India stack and so on. From a business perspective, and especially when you're thinking of building a pro-poor business model, which you are trying to do, how useful or successful has it been? Is it a lot of rhetoric, or is it actually helping you in a very substantial way in serving the customers that you're seeking to serve?
So I think it has overall been pretty transformational. I'll give you a small example of just, how do you authenticate a customer? How do you know that, Varad is indeed Varad? earlier, that used to be quite a task of when all kinds of documents, including voter's ID card, ration card, etc., used to be collected physically, which costs a lot of money, authenticated, letters would be given from the panchayat, from an IAS officer, etc., to ensure that you really are you. And therefore, I mean, that whole business of authenticating people was very, very inefficient. So Aadhaar indeed has made a big difference, because today, for example, when we are delivering financial solutions which are personalized to each customer, we can do the eKYC, the e-signature. We can even sign contracts completely digitally without the movement or use of any paper whatsoever, because the legal frameworks allow that, and the India stack can provide that authentication for the signature. So it's, I do think that a lot of businesses still have to adapt. So when we talk to banks and we say that you can actually give loans without, without wet signatures, they're like, no, it's, the compliance departments are up in arms and they say it's not possible. It's there. So I think the adoption still has to come, and there are only very few people who are actually adapting, because the current participants in the market are sort of resisting the change. On the other hand, I would still say that the cost of all of these services, so for example, eKYC, sign, e-mandates is still very high, and it's not immaterial at all. It probably costs 150 rupees to set all of this up, just pure cost. And that's a significant barrier if you think of, even an India 2 customer earning under 30,000
You think
rupees.
it's a transitional problem, or you think it's...
No, it's, I mean, today that is the cost. I mean, so it's a public policy question as to who, for these customers, should there be a way of making this transition easier? And could that be a place for government or philanthropic institutions to participate? Because we do find it's not an insurmountable barrier, but it's a barrier nonetheless. I think the other, the other issue is that customers don't quite own their own data, and if they did, they would be much more powerful. So actually, everybody else owns their data. So they are, they're getting insured, they're getting subsidies, they have bank account statements, but they're not in control of all of this information. And there is a framework that is, it's called the account aggregator, that's in the works but not yet active. But that again would really empower customers, because now the information is in their hands, and they can leverage it to get better financial services. But the ownership actually needs to be put in their hands, and that framework needs to be actioned really urgently.
Sure, yeah. And I know you need to leave, so thanks for being with us.
No, thank you so much.
But I think the idea that you mentioned, which is just worth emphasizing for this group, is this data fiduciary idea, right? Which is that a new class of intermediaries who can actually look after the interests of the consumer or the data giver, as opposed to the interests of the data collector. And India really has an opportunity to leapfrog many other countries in that way. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Roger, maybe over to you, and maybe zoom out a little bit. This discussion on public policy, markets, and I know as a foundation, you have tried to do a lot of both. And I guess the question is, at a more meta level, how do you think about balancing out, working with this, the government versus, the private sector, broadly speaking?
No, it's a great question. And I think both of your last examples, whether that is sanitation or financial inclusion, are places where there is both an intersection of public and the private sector together. I think the way we think about it is, if we think about why markets don't work for low-income people, part of the reason is that the policies are not designed in a way that really drive low-income people, or they're not fair for them. So we heard you had all of this ID. You used to have to provide the global cost structure of IDing someone is somewhere between $10 and $12. that was just simply unaffordable. Low-income people would have to get a passport or a driver's license. They had no need for those things. And so we actually try and say, what are the public policies that should be in place to make those markets inclusive? But the other side, it's not that the private sector is always just not wanting to deal with those customers. Sometimes it's true, but other times it's just the cost structure is just too high, or the lot size, the transaction size is too small. And that's where technology has made huge differences, and therefore allowed us to move from a cost structure that was $10 to $12 to onboard to $1 to $2. There are some countries that are doing it for just a few cents. That makes a radical difference of bringing low-income people in. You mentioned Bangladesh and sanitation. Tremendous progress on open defecation, but what we would argue, and what I think has been appreciated in the Indian context, is that you have to think about the end-to-end solution of fecal sludge management, because while over 90% of Bangladeshis are not open defecating, only a few percentage points are actually safely treated fecal sludge. And that's where this comes together. Well, what are the right business models that make that possible in India? Government of India is driving new solutions to think about this through end-to-end. And like the Gates Foundation is trying to say, okay, how do we reinvent the toilet so that we don't have to build really large, expensive sewer systems, but there's a way to safely manage? So we actually see it not as one versus the other, but as a real partnership. But you've got to get the policy right, you got to get the economics right, and then you have to provide a way for low-income people's voice and social change to be reflected in those structures. And that sometimes is a really hard piece of it, and we've seen that with smallholder farmers, and IFPRI knows that data around the world best of all.
Yeah, and I think one of the images which is embedded in my mind is, I think, one of the slides that Madhu showed in one of the presentations, which is how the sewage flows from the toilet to actually a safe disposal thing, and how the leakages are in many cities of sort of more than 80-90% is sort of leaked in unsanitary ways.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think Roger spoke about technology. So that's why in the Swachh Bharat mission, the technology which is being promoted for the most part is the twin pit toilet. Now, Bangladesh did mainly single pits, and that's why they now need to get into fecal sludge management. So the twin pit model, which can be used for about 80-85% different parts of India, or covers most of it, it's an eco-friendly model. Because when you shut one pit and you divert to the second, the closed pit, year and a half, and then that safe compost. So you don't have to worry about taking it out and dumping it in a water body, because you don't have effective fecal sludge management. So that technology and other, but this is low cost as well. So that's why it's the preferred choice. So I think that's, again, it's important to make sure that you get the technology right. And this is purely from a twin, a toilet point of view.
And it's a pretty, simple stuff. It's not some high-end software or something like that, which is great. So I wanted to also bring in the discussion on collectives, and Param spoke a little bit about community mobilization being really the heart and soul of Swachh Bharat. Joshi ji, maybe you can reflect a little. I know you're a great advocate of farmer producer organizations as a great way forward for the smallholder farmer in India. But the fact is that FPOs in India have really struggled. Dairy, of course, is probably one example where it has succeeded. Dairy has very particular characteristics, probably that make it relatively easy. What do we do beyond dairy? Can we make farmer producer organizations actually work for the smallholder farmer in India? Is there something in the power of collectives there that can help?
Now, if we have to solve the problems of farmers in India, we have to bring them together. Farmers are to be, they produce together and they market together. Unless they do this, I think their incomes levels are not going to increase. So often I say that Indian agriculture is crowded, risky, and inequitable. So you have to revert it. Then I think what we have to do, we have to bring them together to increase their incomes and to reduce their risk, and also bring them more equity. Their distribution of income is more equitable.
The devil is in the details. So how do you make that make it work?
So here, Government of India already have one program where they are promoting farmer producer organization. There's a organization known as Small Farmer Agri Business Consortia. It was started 20 years ago, But we have forgotten in between the farmer producer, this small farmer business consortia. But recently now the government is coming up more aggressively to promote farmer producer organization, and you have seen that in recent budget also an incentive was given. These farmer producer organizations were giving income tax. And the exemption was that now any farmer organization has turnover of 100 crores, they are exempted from the income tax. There's big incentive for the farmer producer organization. A lot of incentives are given to become the membership of the farmer producer organization. So there is a movement to make more and more farmer producer organizations. Right now in India, less than 1,000 farmers organizations are there.
Yep.
But I think that India should have more than 50,000 of farmers producer organizations, and much more than that.
Is there a good model you've seen which can scale?
Yeah, I tell you what is happening. You know, what is happening in farmer producer organization, that they have a very good linkage at the back end. Back end means they are getting access to fertilizer, they are dealing directly with the dealers or the factories. So seed, fertilizer, pesticide, they are directly dealing and reducing their input costs. So on that front, they are reducing dramatically their cost, which must be reduced. But in front end, they had to be linked with some markets, either these retail chains or hospitals or educational institutions or midday meal schemes. So they have to link with them.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they are not able to link with, because the agriculture they have produce of one-time produce. These retail chains, educational institutions, hostels, hospitals, hotels, they need supply regularly, on a regular basis, on a daily basis. So the firms which are demanding, they cannot go to several of the farmer producer organizations. So there are good examples from the Africa. So what they have done, they have federated these farmer producer organizations. If there is a tomato farmer producer organization, so all tomato farmer producer organizations, they have a federation. So once you federate, so the buyer will only approach to the federation, and then federation will ask them to deliver these material here and there.
Sure.
So this is one thing.
Yeah.
The second is the success model. Is you mentioned that dairy sector, we have the cooperative model was very, very successful. It's a model at the global level. And on the basis of Amul model, there are several cooperatives, milk cooperatives have come up in many of the states. Now, National Dairy Development Board is promoting farmer producer organizations in milk production. So this is another way of approaching farmers to come together at their own, bring their company, and then sell milk, brand it.
Yeah.
The second very important model is the poultry sector. The poultry sector, we have the contract farm. 80% of the poultry, agriculture is completely unorganized sector. But poultry sector is 80% poultry is under organized sector. And there is a strong linkage between private sector, the corporate houses, and the farming communities. And this has led to a poultry revolution in India. The growth of the poultry was more than 12% during last decade. So it was so high, and it also giving high income to the farmers. And there are switch from less remunerative crops to the poultry sector. So there is a switch from sorghum, pearl millet, ragi. These crops are giving low returns to the farmer in rain-fed areas.
Yeah.
So they shifted to the poultry sector. You will see that most of the southern India, they have these poultry sector is coming up in a big way, and they are earning very highly.
So different models for different types of things.
Different
and I think
types
there's
of
definitely
things.
something in this
Yeah.
federation idea that you're
So
talking
federation,
about.
and then also the cluster farming. The cluster farming, Chhattisgarh started with cluster farming. One village will have produce only one or two commodities, and they collect and then they will sell in Calcutta market. So there are different models which are coming up. Only thing is that how to bring them together, the farmers, their production, and then marketing.
So I do want to bring in the audience, but one more question to you, Mirai, because we can't have a discussion on collective without bringing in Seva, which is probably the exemplary example in the country. What do you think? Is there sort of a natural scale to which some of these organizations can grow? Should we be thinking more on the grounds of replication as opposed to scale? What sort of your experience from Seva?
So first and foremost, I think what we've learned, if there's one thing we've learned in the last 45 years, is that the basic building block is organizing, which is bringing women together into their own sustainable membership-based organizations, which, by the way, also help them stand firm in the marketplace. I mean, individually, she doesn't stand a chance. But together, she's a force. Collective strength, her bargaining power. And just one quick example, since you also had an example from the agriculture sector. When we formed women farmers into their own cooperatives, they actually managed to even get a place for the first time ever in the APMC market, the wholesale market,
Right.
a woman-run, all-woman-run, women farmer-run shop. So they could get remunerative prices and also break into this sort of male-dominated APMC market. So all sorts of exciting things happen when the collective forms. I think a couple of things. I think first and foremost, especially with women collectives, it takes us time. I think there's a lot of pressure always, scale up, hurry up, this, that.
Right.
I mean, we are slow. And, slow and steady, we know, wins the race in the end. And the reason we're slow is because we do 150 different things. We do paid work, we do unpaid work, we take care of our children, we take care of elderly.
Is there a breadth versus depth trade-off?
Yes and no. I mean, I wouldn't say a blanket yes, but I think we have to be patient. We have to let people build at their own speed. And there are plenty of examples of scaling up. There are also plenty of examples of excellent sort of small is beautiful. And perhaps, as Dr. Joshi has mentioned, the way to go there is to federate these decentralized small collectives. So I think, we can't just have one blanket, this is how it works and this is. But I think some of the challenges, 2 or 3 of the challenges I want to mention that we've seen is that poor women's collectives, membership-based organizations, they can grow, they will grow. As I said, give them time. But another important point is an enabling environment, particularly for women's collectives. Because of the whole range of activities, economic and household activities that women are involved in, they need support. We heard about low workforce participation. Our studies show that just by introducing full-day childcare for working women, women's incomes double. I mean, how are women going to enter markets and into the economy if these sorts of things are not taken care of? And we've made a start with ICDS, but that's not enough. It has to be tailored. Speaking of systems, the systems have to be tailored according to their reality and their needs. And then only with this kind of enabling environment, their organizations grow and prosper. And the best thing we've seen is that many of them are financially viable, plus democratically women are elected to the boards and the executive committees, and they run. And 80% of our boards and committees are the poor women themselves, and a few people like myself who are there as a support. But increasingly, they're reading balance sheets, they're asking questions, they're ready to go.
Great. So on that optimistic note, let's bring in the audience and your burning questions.